Henry, the general manager of a major tech company, had to deliver devastating news to his wife Olivia, a literature professor with a deep attachment to family traditions. She was the maid of honor at her best friend Emily's wedding, an event planned meticulously over years. Despite promising to be by her side, Henry received an urgent call from his company about a critical international business meeting. The meeting's implications were massive. His absence could jeopardize his career. Olivia had spent weeks looking forward to the wedding. It wasn't just about her role as maid of honor. It was the rare chance for Henry to immerse himself in her world of poets and professors, a world he often claimed to admire from a distance. The announcement came abruptly over breakfast. "I can't make it to Emily's wedding," Henry muttered, eyes glued to his tablet. Olivia froze. "What? You're joking, right? You promised?" Henry glanced at her briefly before returning to his screen. "This meeting is non-negotiable. It's about a potential merger with a European firm. If I don't go, I could risk everything I've worked for." "You mean everything we've worked for?" Olivia shot back, her voice trembling. "Every sacrifice I've made so you could climb this ladder." Her words hung in the air, unacknowledged. Olivia stormed out of the kitchen, leaving her untouched coffee behind. By the time Henry returned from work that evening, the house was eerily quiet. He found Olivia sitting on their bed, her dress for the wedding laid out beside her. "Isn't it ironic?" she began, her voice steady but sharp. "The man who tells me every day that I'm his rock, his balance, is so easily swayed by a conference room of strangers." "Olivia, this isn't about us," Henry tried, loosening his tie. "That's exactly the problem," she replied. "Nothing ever is." The day of the wedding arrived, and Olivia was left to attend alone. As she walked into the elegantly decorated venue, whispers followed her. Friends and relatives had been eager to meet Henry, the enigmatic figure she often spoke of with pride. His absence became a source of speculation. Emily pulled Olivia aside. "Where's Henry?" "Everyone's asking." Olivia forced a smile. "Work emergency." "Typical," Emily muttered, shaking her head. Back in the meeting, Henry tried to focus, but his phone vibrated incessantly with notifications, photos from the wedding. Olivia's smile in the pictures looked forced, her eyes hollow. A particular image stood out. Olivia laughing with a tall man in a tailored suit, holding 2 champagne flutes. That night, Olivia came home later than expected. She reeked of wine and perfume, her cheeks flushed. "How was it?" Henry asked cautiously. "Wonderful," Olivia replied, her tone distant. "I had an excellent time. Met someone who actually listens." Henry froze. "What does that mean?" "It means," she said, pulling off her earrings with deliberate slowness, "that I danced, laughed, and for the first time in years, I didn't feel invisible." The room fell silent except for the sound of her jewelry landing on the dresser. The following week, Olivia received a bouquet at her office, but it wasn't from Henry. The attached card read, "For the most enchanting woman in the room." Henry saw the florist's receipt on their shared credit card statement days later. When he confronted Olivia, she met his anger with an unnerving calm. "You weren't there," she said simply. "And someone else was?" Henry couldn't shake the image of Olivia with that man at the wedding. He started to question every late-night grading session, every time she left her phone face down. Paranoia set in, and work became an escape. Meanwhile, Olivia remained poised, almost indifferent, to Henry's spiraling unease. She knew the power of withholding an answer, a lesson she had learned from years of silence in their marriage. Weeks later, the tension erupted during a dinner party they hosted. A colleague of Henry's made a passing remark. "Henry's dedication is unmatched. I don't know how you put up with his schedule, Olivia." Her laughter rang hollow. "Oh, I've learned to keep myself occupied." The guests exchanged awkward glances, and Henry felt the ground shift beneath him. Their once unshakable relationship now stood on a precipice, with Olivia's cryptic actions and Henry's relentless pursuit of his career chipping away at its foundation. Neither could admit they were at fault, but both knew they had lost something vital, perhaps forever. Henry stepped off the plane hours earlier than anticipated, a surprise he had meticulously planned. The business meeting had concluded quicker than expected, And rather than alert Olivia, he decided to surprise her at Emily's wedding. A gesture of goodwill, he thought. A way to make amends. He pictured her expression, shock, delight, maybe a hint of forgiveness. As the taxi wound its way through the city, he rehearsed what he'd say. The venue loomed ahead, glowing with soft lights that spilled onto the cobblestone street. The chatter and laughter of guests reached his ears as he entered the grand hall. Henry smoothed his suit jacket, his heart pounding, and stepped inside. The first thing he noticed was the crowd, a sea of well-dressed strangers. Then his eyes landed on Olivia. She was on the dance floor, a vision in emerald green, moving effortlessly to the rhythm of a jazz ensemble. But her partner wasn't another wedding guest or even Emily. It was him. Henry's stomach twisted. Eric, the ex-husband Olivia had rarely spoken about but whose shadow had loomed over their marriage. Eric, the cardiologist with the charm of a movie star and the confidence to match. The two swayed close, their faces illuminated by the flickering chandelier. Olivia's head tilted back in laughter as Eric whispered something in her ear. Her hand rested lightly on his chest, their bodies inches apart. Henry froze, his feet rooted to the polished floor. He watched as Eric twirled Olivia, her gown catching the light like a living flame. When she spun back into Eric's arms, their faces aligned, and then it happened. A kiss. It wasn't an innocent peck or an accidental brush of lips. It was deliberate, slow, and intimate. Olivia's fingers lingered on Eric's lapel, pulling him closer. The room seemed to tilt as Henry's world shattered. Henry's instinct was to walk away, to storm out and leave her there. But a surge of rage overtook him, propelling him forward instead. As he approached the dance floor, the crowd parted slightly, giving him an unobstructed view of the betrayal. "Olivia," he barked, his voice cutting through the music. She spun around, her face draining of color as her eyes locked onto his. Eric stepped back, his hands instinctively dropping to his sides. "Henry," Olivia stammered, her voice barely audible. "So this is what I get for coming back early to surprise you," Henry spat, his voice trembling with fury. "My wife, kissing her ex-husband in the middle of a wedding. How poetic." The room went silent, the music tapering off awkwardly. Guests turned to watch, their curiosity palpable. Emily's horrified face peeked from the corner, her champagne flute frozen midair. "It's not what it looks like," Olivia blurted, stepping toward Henry. "Don't insult my intelligence," he snapped, stepping back. "How long has this been going on? Or was this just a one-night encore performance?" Eric, trying to salvage his dignity, interjected, "Henry, let's not make a scene." Henry turned on him, his voice rising. "A scene? You think this is a scene, Eric? You've been kissing another man's wife in plain view of everyone. I'd say you made the scene." The humiliation was unbearable, but Henry wasn't done. He grabbed a nearby microphone, his hands shaking as he addressed the crowd. "To all of you watching," he began, his voice bitter and sharp, "I'd like to introduce my wife, Olivia, and her dance partner. You may recognize him as her ex-husband, though apparently, the ex is more of a technicality." "Henry, stop," Olivia begged, her eyes welling with tears. "But, too much truth for you?" He glared at her. "You made me believe you were struggling with my absence, that this marriage was your priority. Meanwhile, you were rekindling old flames." Eric placed a hand on Olivia's arm, a futile attempt at support. It only enraged Henry further. "Get your hands off her," Henry growled. "Or is this just your idea of saving hearts, doctor?" The crowd gasped, and Eric's face flushed crimson. Olivia tried to speak, but the words caught in her throat. Henry's relentless fury pinned her in place. "You know," he continued, his voice breaking slightly, "I gave up a meeting that could have defined my career to be here for you. To show you that I still cared about us. And this," he gestured toward her and Eric, "this is what I walked into." "You don't understand," Olivia finally managed, her voice trembling. "Then enlighten me," Henry demanded. Her lips parted, but no explanation came. The silence was louder than any excuse she could muster. The whispers among the guests grew louder, their judgment heavy in the air. Olivia glanced around, her humiliation now matched by Henry's. She had never seen him this unrestrained, this vulnerable. Eric, sensing he was no longer welcome, muttered an apology and began to retreat, but Henry wasn't finished. "Run along, Eric," Henry said coldly. "You've always been good at leaving messes behind for others to clean up." Eric paused but didn't turn back. Henry looked at Olivia one last time, his expression a mixture of heartbreak and disgust. "I hope he was worth it," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Then, without waiting for her response, he turned and left the room. The aftershock of his departure rippled through the wedding. Emily hurried to Olivia's side, whispering frantic apologies for inviting Eric in the first place. But Olivia barely heard her. She stood frozen in the center of the dance floor, her once elegant gown now feeling like a weight pulling her into the ground. Henry sat in his car in the dark parking lot, staring at the steering wheel. His hands were still trembling, his chest tight with anger and pain. He couldn't decide whether to drive home or to a hotel, or to nowhere at all. For the first time in years, Henry felt powerless. The man who had always been in control, who prided himself on solving problems with precision and logic, was utterly defeated by the one person he thought he could trust. Back in the venue, Olivia remained under the harsh gaze of dozens of wedding guests, her humiliation complete. Henry stood frozen for a long moment, his chest rising and falling with slow, deliberate breaths as the world around him seemed to blur. The shock of seeing Olivia wrapped in her ex-husband's arms still vibrated in his mind, but now it solidified into something colder. Not rage, something sharper. Precision. His hand instinctively went to his pocket, pulling out his phone. If she thought this betrayal would be buried in the confusion of the moment, she was mistaken. Henry unlocked his phone, steadying it in his hand. Olivia and Eric were still on the dance floor, their post-kiss awkwardness painfully obvious. Guests were already murmuring, and the tension in the room was palpable. Henry adjusted his phone's camera and snapped the first photo. Then another. Each click of the shutter felt like sealing evidence for an inevitable confrontation. The flash caught Olivia's attention, her eyes widening as she spotted him holding the phone up. She stepped away from Eric, her hand flying to her mouth in panic. "Henry, what are you doing?" she stammered, her voice shaky but not loud enough to disrupt the room. He lowered the phone, slipping it back into his pocket with eerie calm. Collecting proof, he replied evenly. His voice lacked anger. It was steady, calculated, and cutting. "Proof of what?" Eric interjected, his attempt at bravado failing as his voice cracked. "Proof that the woman I've devoted my life to has no respect for the vows she made," Henry said, looking directly at Olivia. "Proof that the person she ran back to was the one she swore didn't matter anymore." Olivia's face turned pale. She reached for him, but Henry stepped back. "Don't," he said, holding up a hand. "You've done enough." Guests watched as Henry's words cut through Olivia like a blade. Emily rushed over, her face flushed with anxiety. "Henry, please," she whispered, glancing nervously at the gawking crowd. "Not here. Let's talk somewhere private." Henry's eyes never left Olivia. "Private? But so she can twist the story? So she can make excuses?" He gestured toward Eric. "No, Emily, let everyone see this. Let everyone know who Olivia really is." "Henry, please stop," Olivia begged, tears brimming in her eyes. "Stop." He tilted his head. "You didn't stop when you invited him into your arms. You didn't stop when you kissed him in front of everyone. Why should I?" The tension in the room was unbearable. Eric, visibly uncomfortable, tried to speak. "Henry, this isn't what it looks like." Henry's laugh was hollow, devoid of humor. "Oh, I see. The classic line. It's not what it looks like." He shook his head. "Tell me, Eric, what exactly am I misunderstanding here? Because from where I'm standing, it looks like my wife is reliving her past right in front of me." Eric opened his mouth but said nothing. Henry straightened his jacket, his movements deliberate and methodical. "Olivia," he began, his voice quieter now, "this is the last time you'll humiliate me. Whatever connection you and Eric think you have, you can enjoy it, without me." "What are you saying?" Olivia whispered, tears now streaming down her face. "I'm saying it's over," Henry said bluntly. "Our marriage. Our life together. Everything. Done. A collective gasp rippled through the crowd. Olivia's knees buckled slightly, and she clutched Emily's arm for support. Henry, no. Please, she pleaded. This isn't what you think. We can talk about this. Please don't do this here. Henry's expression hardened. You already did this here. I'm just finishing what you started. Emily tried to intervene, her voice frantic. Henry, maybe give her a chance to explain. He held up a hand to silence her. Explain? Explain what? That she thought no one would notice? That she couldn't wait until I was out of town to run back to him? No, Emily. There's nothing left to explain. Turning back to Olivia, he spoke with chilling finality. I came back early to surprise you, to show you that I was still invested in us despite everything. And what did I find? You in his arms, kissing him like the past 10 years meant nothing. That's not true. Olivia cried. You do mean something to me, everything to me. Save it, Henry said, his voice like steel. If I meant everything to you, this wouldn't have happened. Henry scanned the room, addressing the stunned audience. Let this be a lesson to everyone here, he said, his voice carrying across the hall. Trust is fragile. And once it's broken, there's no going back. With that, he turned on his heel and walked toward the exit, his footsteps echoing in the silence. Olivia ran after him, catching his arm just as he reached the door. Henry, please. Don't leave like this. Let me explain. He yanked his arm free, his gaze piercing. Explain? The photos are explanation enough. We're done, Olivia. I'll send someone for my things. Her voice cracked as she called after him, but Henry didn't look back. The ride home was a blur. Henry sat in the back seat of the cab, staring out the window as the city lights streaked past. His phone buzzed with messages, probably Olivia, or maybe Emily trying to mediate. He didn't check. When he reached their house, it felt empty despite being filled with memories. The pictures on the walls, the furniture they'd picked out together, all of it now felt meaningless. He sat down at the dining table, pulling out his phone again. He scrolled through the photos he had taken, each one a reminder of what he had witnessed. There was no anger in his expression now, just exhaustion and a profound sense of loss. The texts from Olivia kept coming, each one more desperate than the last. Henry, I'm sorry. Please come back. We can fix this. I made a mistake. He finally replied with a single message, it's too late. As the hours passed, Henry began to draft his next steps. Divorce papers, splitting assets, notifying mutual friends. He would do it all with the same precision he had brought to his career. He wasn't going to let Olivia, or anyone else, derail his life further. By the time the sun rose, Henry had already packed a suitcase. The man who had walked into that wedding the night before was gone, replaced by someone colder, harder, and ready to move on. The morning after the wedding, Henry sat at the kitchen table, staring at the divorce attorney's number on his phone. The house was quiet, eerily so, given the chaos that had erupted less than 12 hours ago. He hadn't slept, his mind replaying every agonizing detail. The kiss, Olivia's tearful pleas, the stunned faces of onlookers. With a deep breath, he dialed the number. Hello, this is the office of Martin and Blake. How can we assist you? I need to file for divorce, Henry said bluntly, his voice devoid of emotion. By the time Olivia arrived home later that morning, she found Henry sitting in the living room, a suitcase by his side. She hesitated in the doorway, her face still puffy from crying. Henry, she began softly, stepping inside. Don't, he interrupted, his tone sharp enough to make her stop in her tracks. There's nothing left to say. Please, just listen, Olivia pleaded. It was a mistake. I don't know what came over me. Henry held up his hand. Spare me the excuses. I've already contacted a divorce attorney. This marriage is over. Her knees nearly buckled at his words. You're not serious? I've never been more serious, he said, standing and grabbing his suitcase. You'll be hearing from my lawyer soon. Olivia followed him to the door, her desperation spilling over. Henry, don't do this. We can fix it. I'll do anything, therapy, counseling, whatever you want. Just don't leave like this. He paused, his hand on the doorknob. For a moment, he considered her words, the memories of their life together flickering in his mind. But then the image of her and Eric on the dance floor replaced them. Without looking at her, he said, "You already made your choice, Olivia. Now I'm making mine." The door shut behind him, leaving Olivia standing alone in the entryway, tears streaming down her face. Henry moved into a small, upscale apartment in the city, far from the suburban home he and Olivia had shared. He threw himself into his work, using the demands of his career to drown out the lingering pain. Meanwhile, Olivia was left to pick up the pieces of her shattered life. The house, once a symbol of their shared dreams, now felt like a mausoleum. Friends who had once admired their seemingly perfect marriage now avoided her calls, the whispers about her betrayal spreading like wildfire. The divorce process was swift and merciless. Henry, ever the pragmatist, made it clear to his attorney that he wanted no delays or drawn-out negotiations. He agreed to let Olivia keep the house, a gesture that initially seemed generous but was laced with finality. "This house is yours," he told her during one of their few brief encounters. "I don't want anything that reminds me of us." Olivia's hands trembled as she held the paperwork, her eyes scanning the cold, impersonal language that marked the end of their marriage. "You're just walking away from everything we built?" "You destroyed it, Olivia," Henry said simply. "I'm just cleaning up the mess." The humiliation didn't stop there. Olivia received the news of the divorce in the same week her university colleagues began whispering about her personal life. The story of her kiss with Eric had somehow spread beyond the wedding guests, and now it was a topic of gossip in the faculty lounge. One colleague approached her after a staff meeting, his tone laced with feigned sympathy. "Olivia, I heard about everything. I hope you're holding up." Her face burned with shame. "I'd prefer not to discuss it," she muttered, retreating to her office. But the whispers followed her everywhere. Henry, meanwhile, refused all contact with Olivia outside of legal matters. Every attempt she made to reach him was met with silence. Texts went unread, calls unanswered. The man who had once been her confidant, her partner, was now a stranger. In one last desperate attempt, Olivia showed up at his office unannounced. "I told you we have nothing to talk about," Henry said coldly when his assistant informed him she was waiting in the lobby. "Please," Olivia begged. "Just 5 minutes?" Against his better judgment, Henry relented, meeting her in a private conference room. "What do you want, Olivia?" he asked, his arms crossed. "I want to apologize," she said, her voice breaking. "For everything. For taking you for granted, for hurting you, for..." Henry stared at her, his face unreadable. "Apology accepted. Now what?" Her breath hitched. "Now, we try to move forward. Together." He shook his head. "No, Olivia. You don't get to rewrite the ending. This is over. It's been over since the moment you decided to kiss him." Tears streamed down her face as she realized the finality of his words. "I love you, Henry." "No," he said firmly. "You love the idea of me. The stability, the security. But you didn't love me enough to respect me." With that, he stood and left the room, leaving Olivia sobbing at the table. The divorce was finalized 2 months later. Henry didn't attend the court hearing in person, opting to let his attorney handle the formalities. Olivia, on the other hand, sat in the courtroom, feeling the weight of her decisions settle like a stone in her chest. In the months that followed, Henry flourished professionally. The merger he had prioritized over the wedding turned out to be a massive success, earning him accolades and a promotion. His colleagues admired his resilience, though they never pried into his personal life. Olivia, however, struggled to rebuild. The house became a constant reminder of her mistakes, its walls echoing with the absence of the man she had betrayed. She tried to reach out to Eric, perhaps hoping for some comfort, but he had returned to his own life, unwilling to be tied to the wreckage of hers. Henry's final act of closure came when he removed the last traces of Olivia from his life. He packed up the few personal items he had brought to his apartment, photos, mementos, and placed them in a box labeled memories. He set it outside his door for donation. As the truck pulled away, Henry felt an unfamiliar lightness. For the first time in years, he was free. Henry's life had settled into a strange calm after the divorce, his days filled with work and his evenings spent alone in his sleek, modern apartment. The silence was heavy at first, a stark contrast to the years of shared laughter, or arguments, with Olivia. But over time, he grew to appreciate the solitude. Gave him space to think, to rebuild. One morning, while preparing a presentation for an upcoming product launch, Henry realized he needed help with the design work. His assistant recommended a freelance graphic designer named Sarah, who had worked on several projects for their firm. "She's talented and efficient," the assistant assured him. Henry nodded absently, agreeing to the suggestion. The first time he met Sarah, she walked into his office with a confident stride, her portfolio tucked under one arm. She was young, mid-20s, he guessed, but carried herself with a maturity that immediately caught his attention. Her dark hair was pulled into a neat ponytail, and her eyes sparkled with a mix of enthusiasm and professionalism. "Mr. Turner," she said, extending her hand. "I'm Sarah. I've heard great things about your work." Henry shook her hand, offering a polite smile. "Let's see if you can keep up with it," he replied, his tone teasing. Working together quickly became a highlight of Henry's days. Sarah was sharp and creative, offering ideas that often took his projects to new heights. Their conversations, initially about work, began to stray into personal territory. She told him about her journey into design, her love for art, and her dreams of one day opening her own studio. Henry found himself drawn to her energy, her optimism, a stark contrast to the bitterness and exhaustion that had plagued his marriage. One evening, after a particularly successful project, Henry invited Sarah out for dinner as a thank you. It was meant to be professional, but the conversation flowed so naturally that it felt like anything but. "You're not what I expected," Sarah said over dessert, her tone playful. Henry raised an eyebrow. "Oh, and what did you expect? Someone colder. Maybe a bit of a perfectionist tyrant," she admitted with a laugh. "But you're surprisingly human." "Surprisingly?" Henry echoed, chuckling. "I'll take that as a compliment." Their relationship evolved gradually. Late-night dinners turned into weekend outings. They discovered shared interests: art galleries, jazz concerts, quiet walks through the city. For the first time in years, Henry found himself laughing without restraint, feeling a lightness he thought he'd lost forever. Their age difference wasn't lost on anyone, least of all Henry. At first, he was cautious, wary of how their relationship might be perceived. But Sarah brushed aside his concerns. "Does it bother you?" she asked one night as they sat on the balcony of his apartment, overlooking the city lights. "No," Henry admitted after a pause. "But it might bother others." "Then let them be bothered," Sarah said simply, taking his hand. "I'm happy. Are you?" Henry looked at her, her face lit softly by the glow of the city below, and nodded. "Yes, I am." News of Henry's new relationship eventually reached Olivia through mutual acquaintances. The knowledge hit her like a punch to the gut. Hearing about Sarah, young, talented, beautiful, only deepened her humiliation. She had clung to the hope that Henry's departure was temporary, that he would return once the pain of her betrayal dulled. But the sight of a photo someone shared, a candid shot of Henry and Sarah walking hand in hand through the park, shattered any illusions she'd held onto. Henry, meanwhile, was moving forward in every sense. As his relationship with Sarah deepened, he began to think about the future, something he hadn't dared to do in years. One evening, as they sat together in her small but charming apartment, Sarah hesitated before speaking. "I've been thinking," she began, her voice tentative, "about what's next for us." Henry's heart skipped a beat. "What do you mean?" "I mean, do you see us building a life together? A family?" He hadn't expected the question, but as he looked at her, he realized he already knew the answer. "Yes," he said simply. "I do." 6 months later, Henry proposed during a quiet weekend getaway. Sarah accepted without hesitation, tears of joy streaming down her face. Their wedding was intimate and elegant, attended by close friends and family. The absence of certain people, Olivia, notably, wasn't even a shadow over the day. As they settled into married life, Henry and Sarah began discussing where they wanted to live. Sarah wanted space for her studio, and Henry wanted a home that felt permanent, secure. One evening, while browsing real estate listings, Henry stumbled upon something unexpected: his old house with Olivia, listed for sale. "Is that?" Sarah began, leaning over his shoulder. "Yes," Henry said, his voice tinged with surprise. He hadn't thought about the house in months, but seeing it again stirred something in him. It wasn't nostalgia. It was the realization that the house didn't belong to the past. It could be part of the future. After some deliberation, Henry decided to buy it back. Walking through the familiar rooms during the final inspection felt surreal, but with Sarah by his side, the house felt different, lighter, warmer. They moved in a few weeks later, transforming the space into a reflection of their shared dreams. Sarah set up her studio in one of the sunlit rooms, while Henry filled the walls with art and photographs from their travels. A year later, they welcomed their first child, a daughter they named Lily. Standing in the nursery one evening, holding Lily in his arms as Sarah watched with a smile, Henry felt a sense of peace he hadn't known was possible. The house, once a symbol of betrayal and loss, was now filled with laughter and love. Henry had built a new life, one that felt stronger and more authentic than anything he'd known before. And as he kissed Sarah's forehead and placed Lily gently in her crib, he knew he'd finally found his way home.